The aim of the experiments was to send an emissary into time to summon the past and future to the aid of the present. At the outset, I must refer the reader to my prior volume of writings published by Sublation, The Death of the Millennial Left, Interventions 2006 to 2022. The essays collected in the present book were the result of my role as a teacher in my extracurricular capacities as chief pedagogue for the Platypus Affiliated Society, of which I was a founding member. As I conceived and announced it when I started writing these essays, it was a matter of turning the internal pedagogy outward, namely, making it public and engaging the left on this basis. There were broadly two phases to this effort, each in the aftermath of a downturn on the millennial left. A turn to reconsiderations of Marxism after the collapse of the anti-war movement and eruption of the financial crisis with Obama's election in 2008, and to questions of the meaning of socialism after the failure of anti-austerity protests, Occupy Wall Street, and the Arab Spring, but before the advent of new socialist parties with Podemos in Spain and Syriza in Greece, or Jeremy Corbyn's ascension to leadership of the Labour Party in the UK, and the Bernie Sanders campaign for nomination by the Democratic Party after Obama's presidency, the latter of which led to the refound positive currency of the word socialism in mainstream American political discourse, and the joining of massive numbers of politicized millennials in the Democratic Socialists of America. As a college professor, my responsibilities are to the subject matter of my intellectual knowledge and scholarly expertise. In Platypus, my obligations have been somewhat different since they involve politics, or at least the semblance thereof, and are in the public sphere that is fundamentally different from the private space that defines the academic classroom. It is appropriate, therefore, that my essays from this time be published for more widespread reading, and are taken together as a coherent whole. My prior book, The Death of the Millennial Left, provides the political historical context for the more theoretically oriented and deeply historical register of the essays collected in this volume. That said, as I wrote in the preface to my previous book, it is not a matter of my political commitments and beliefs guiding my theory, but rather the opposite, my theoretical perspective informing my views of present capitalist politics and of left responses to it. It must necessarily seem to come from left field, so to speak, if not another planet. I wrote far more words and a much greater number of essays on Marxist theory and history than I did remarking on contemporary political events, as it turns out nearly 3 times as much. The issue is the motivation for these writings assembled here, namely Platypus's engagements with the self-educational process of the millennial left over its many years and paths of peregrination. The various moments of the millennial left were the different occasions for my attempts at clarifying the history and theory of Marxism, to participate in the earnest investigation into and learning from Marxist history that was attempted in the past 2 decades. I wrote out of my experience of this history as recalled in the present, less from my own activist past and concerns, which were 3 or 4 decades old, and more in accompanying its new students, trying to see things through their eyes, or at least thereby to challenge my own assumptions and preoccupations, something I do routinely when teaching historical material in my academic role. I could not assume a priori any singular purpose or direction, as the millennials' investigations, as that of any genuine students, were exploratory and open-ended. Still, there are certain abiding themes linking and threaded through all of the essays collected here, not provided by me so much as their historical moment. And in hindsight, as indicated by the subtitle of this book, there has come into focus an inexorable task around which everything has orbited, as if about a dark star, or at least an eclipsed sun, the need for a socialist party and a Marxist self-consciousness of its true mission and purpose. One key concern that comes forth in these essays has been the need to address and show how the long-standing conflicts and oppositions on the left between supposed authoritarian versus libertarian traditions of socialism or communism, the source of a compulsory meme for the millennials, intersecting this antinomical axis with another, that of the purported binary of capitalism versus socialism, either had been overcome by or had not applied to original historical Marxism. This allowed me to put aside entirely the sundry fruitless dead-end pseudo-debates within ostensible Marxism and the greater left that had blocked developments for so long, The reader will note how I actively avoid, because I do not accept, the terms of these long-standing debates. Alongside the millennial left, I have sought a new direction from history. This was something I thought was possible for the millennial left to do, or to have done, since unfortunately they ultimately have not done so, and now no longer will. My two students who first summoned me to my role as teacher of the millennial left were themselves a bit older, graduate students, and came from an anarchist background. They commended my ability to transcend the authoritarian versus libertarian divide, but quit platypus when we came around to reading Lenin. The younger students stayed on, excited to violate the taboos forbidding this history. As I quipped at the time, using a title from my own adolescent education, I was going to allow them to explore uninhibited everything you always wanted to know about Marxism but were afraid to ask. In the aftermath of the millennial retreat from such encouraging openness, the question is not the potential and hence imperative for the reconstruction of a true Marxist perspective out of the historical wreckage, palpable when I was writing these essays during the millennial left moment, but rather any possible future for doing so that could and should come with new generations of interest in and curiosity about Marxism. The questions and problems presented by the abandoned and overgrown monument of Marxism, an artifact of a lost world that is nevertheless inevitably rediscovered from time to time by the intrepid and unwary lost children making their ways through the jungle of capitalism. The millennials did not themselves add anything lasting to this archaeological dig, as their own efforts were so ephemeral and seemingly eagerly cut short, not even leaving evidence of iconoclastic vandalism, nor any other remaining traces of their all too brief temporary encampment. What followed them has not been another generation of explorers resuming this work of investigation, but the grim reenactment ceremonies of a Zoomer cargo cult at the vacated site in the shadow of the monolith, where the bones of past sacrificial victims are wielded as weapons. This book is less a set of messages in a bottle washed ashore by waves of the past crashing against our time, and more my own inscribed golden disc to be carried by the Voyager deep space probe after its fissile power core has gone cold, adrift on the cosmic tides and gravitational attractions of interstellar history, among its constantly shifting constellations. I must address the purpose and spirit of these essays. The unfortunate generational narcissism of the millennials is striking, in comparison to my own experience, that informed my approach to history. As a member of Gen X, I knew that a great deal had happened in the past and weighed heavily on the mind of the present. The millennials, by contrast, have seemed to think that history began with them. In this, they have been very much like the 1960s baby boomer New Left cohort, who thought that they were going to proceed to right the world in ways their forebears could not possibly have done due to their supposed ignorance and backwardness. They thought that only they, in their time, were socially and historically conscious, aware of the horrors of oppression and exploitation to which previous generations have been blind. I myself could never have had such an illusion, coming of age as I did in a time, the so-called end of history, anxious to put to rest the utopianism of the past, of which Marxism was seemingly the greatest and most dangerous form. My essays have been less theses of their own than reader's guides or even annotated bibliographies of what I consider priority material in the existing corpus of writings by and about Marxism, leading attention and drawing focus in order to not lose sight of their unifying red thread. But it is important to note that my writings cannot substitute for reading the original historical Marxist works I reference. My own experience reading and learning Marxism instructed and directed me. I am aware of how much in Marxism remains opaque, causing the eyes to glaze over, and it tends to be the most important parts. It is the most difficult to understand and even impossible to comprehend aspects of Marxism that are its most urgent matters. The strangeness of Marxism is what makes it most worthwhile to consider. I address the issues and problems raised in these essays through engagements with the preceding generations of the left, specifically that of the 1960s New Left, perhaps the last genuine attempt to regain knowledge of Marxism, often through their writings, but sometimes in person, through public forum panel discussions, as well as in private conversations. Andrew Feenberg, Douglas Kellner, Paul LeBlanc, Lars Lee, Mike McNair, Leo Panich, Robert Pippin, Moish Postone, Adolf Reed, Gillian Rose, and others. I also addressed prominent figures whom I have not met, such as Alain Badiou and Slavoj Žižek. In these writings, I sought to prompt discussion through articulating explicitly what is almost never said, indeed, actively silenced. There were two particular engagements that motivated many of my essays in this volume. What has been called the Great Lenin Debate that culminated in 2011 to 2012, before, during, and after the anti-austerity and Occupy movement and Arab Spring, and the subsequent debate on Lukács's early Marxist writings. Both of these were centered on discussion fostered by the Communist Party of Great Britain, the CPGB, whose prominent member Mike McNair was an important interlocutor in each debate. They were connected by and through another conversation motivated by the millennial left, what was once called the party question in the history of Marxism. At the dawn of the millennial left, in 2005, Lars Lee had published a new translation of and book on Lenin's What Is to Be Done. And the founding editor and publisher of Jacobin magazine, Democratic Socialists of America member Bhaskar Sankara, had taken up Mike McNair's book Revolutionary Strategy in the task of forging left unity and finding a path to a political party for socialism that he had eluded prior generations, going back to the 1930s. McNair and Lee had emphasized the Kautskyist background for Lenin, something my former comrades in the Spartacist League had also foregrounded. I spoke on a panel with Lee on Lenin's Marxism, and I wrote a critical review of McNair's book that was published in the CPGB's newspaper, The Weekly Worker. I have debated McNair on the topic of the party, both in person and in print on several occasions. Many members of the Democratic Socialists of America have been influenced by Lee and McNair's writings on Lenin and the Second International Marxism more generally, and I sought to contribute to their learning from Lenin. My participation in the debate around Georg Lukács's book History and Class Consciousness and related contemporaneous writings was prepared by my long study of and scholarly work on Theodore W. Adorno's Marxism, during which I helped disinter and spur translation and publication of the 1956 conversation between Frankfurt Institute for Social Research director Max Horkheimer and Adorno on the project, ultimately abandoned, of writing a new communist manifesto for the 20th century, after the experience of the failure of Marxism to achieve socialism, which they intended to be nonetheless Leninist. It seemed a shocking revelation to everyone but me that Adorno and other Frankfurt School critical theorists had been admirers and followers of Lenin. Other previously unknown writings by Horkheimer and Adorno were the occasions for several of the essays collected here. The relevance of this historical material is not self-evident, and indeed the obscurity of the Marxism of the Frankfurt School is a good indicator of what is usually neglected as the esoteric content of Marxism, whether that of Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, Leon Trotsky, Karl Kautsky, Walter Benjamin, Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, among many others, or that of Marx and Engels themselves. I refer the reader to the recent books by my close friend and collaborator Spencer Leonard, who has introduced and published 2 volumes of political writings by Marx and Engels on Bonapartism and imperialism, the selection of which was motivated by the needs of our common teaching in Platypus. As part of the Platypus Project's educating the millennial left on this historically forgotten thought of Marxism, I made a deliberate and even systematic effort to focus on what is usually glossed over or even suppressed, and for younger people what is often completely invisible in Marxism. This means reading Marxism against the grain of its own history, especially considering that the last 100 years, the 20th century, as I discuss in several of my essays here, was the time of the self-liquidation and active forgetting of Marxism, repressed less by its opponents than by its purported proponents themselves. This is not least the meaning of the vexed and often controversial term Stalinism, a word that still elicits immediate hatred of anyone who utters it on the left as a despised trot. Yes, I have been touched by Trotsky in the Frankfurt School, so widely vilified by past generations of the left, but in ways that were evidently unique, as I had to maintain Marxism against both Trotskyism and the late but to my mind confused currency during my own lifetime of Frankfurt School critical theory as it was rediscovered after the failure of the 1960s New Left. One Marxist concept that elicits scorn or mere bemusement that I discuss in several of these essays is the dictatorship of the proletariat. As I describe it, the centrally defining but also most controversial idea in Marxism, denounced by its avowed opponents and renounced by its ostensible adherents. As with all else in the history of Marxism on which I have written, this has been taken as a negative rather than positive object, the dictatorship of the proletariat as the missing goal or task that defines the present absence of Marxism. I have been aware since a young age that my interest in Marxism has made me strangely unwelcome on the left. This has also meant that what I found so impressive and never forgot about Marxism, and which used to be taken for granted by and about it, has become peculiar, a blind spot towards which it is very difficult to draw attention without being suspected of trying to trick or mislead through optical illusion or sleight of hand. Why is Cutrone going on about that? He must be up to no good. Marxism was an unwelcome inconvenience, which was often identified with me as a personal idiosyncrasy. This was ultimately the opinion even of my own personal mentors on the left and in Marxism. For discussion of the influence of my own teachers, see the prologue to The Death of the Millennial Left on my Paths to Marxism. This despite my own doubts and misgivings about Marxism, and my eager willingness to hear any and all arguments against it. My interest in Marxism has been driven by honest curiosity. My commitment to it has not been primarily to the answers or solutions it might provide, but the questions and problems it poses. They have not gone away in my lifetime, and I suspect they will not anytime soon. It is not for me to claim that Marxism is in any way good. Rather, so long as anyone is still interested in or curious about Marxism, I have felt it my duty to stand for its authentic memory against its myriad falsifications or just plain oblivion. A thankless task, but one of which I remain convinced will eventually prove crucial and essential to get beyond capitalism. Not least because, whatever we might call its essential character, clearly the modern world faces new and unprecedented problems in history. But I have been aware that preserving the memory of Marxism will not necessarily be through fidelity or orthodoxy. Indeed, some of the greatest insights into Marxism have been by non- and even anti-Marxists. I am open to potential post-Marxist and even non-Marxist paths to freedom, if earned and not falsely assumed by mere ignorance, which results merely in sub-Marxism, avoiding the profound problems Marxism presents. Marxism might want to be forgotten, but it might be actually overcome in practical reality and not merely in theory in order to do so. The history of the millennial left, refracted indirectly in its many facets and aspects in these essays, was one of trying to actively remember Marxism and thus hopefully truly, and not falsely, forget it. This task has so far failed, and so my writings collected in this book have proved necessary to publish. They thus close a definite chapter of history, both in the world and of my own life and thinking. While I always suspected that I was writing less for my own formative moment, and really for the time now past of the millennial left, specifically, and more for posterity, it is nonetheless sobering to confront that fact marked by this publication. I used to joke that my writings were destined immediately for the archive. This is what both these books form now. It is my wish that, as I intended when originally writing them, these essays will spark and help illuminate further investigation into the history of Marxism, according to the light of the stars guiding my own learning and teaching, Marx, Lenin, and Adorno. This book was originally conceived in 2018 to be published alongside another collection of essays by Platypus, Marxism in the Age of Trump, to which I contributed and edited. This was meant to mark what I called the death of the millennial left in 2017. The millennial reconsideration of original historical Marxism came to an end at that time, along with interest in refounding an independent socialist party, in favor of the DSA and participation in capitalist politics via the Bernie Sanders campaign and the election of the Squad, Democratic Socialists, etc. Publishing this book now in 2024 has the unintended effect of marking the centenary of Lenin's death in 1924. Unlike Philip Cunliffe, whose counterfactual history novel Lenin Lives was in part inspired by my writings on Lenin, and who has marked the 100th anniversary of Lenin's death this year with a call to bury Lenin along with the rest of the 20th century left's heritage, I think we not only should but must remember Lenin. Not in order to try repeating this history, and certainly not to repeat his distorted after effects in Marxist-Leninist Stalinism and Trotskyism, but to recall the task Lenin set himself as a follower of Marx.